No, it's an interesting one, because that's why I've asked you, just to make sure. What do you mean by dropping the body?
Well, when I...
No, I know, of course,
yeah.
I know, darling.
Yeah.
You know, it's a matter of speech.
Yeah.
That's just being,
Leave the body.
Yeah. No, I like dropping the body.
Okay.
Why not?
Okay.
No, why not?
Okay.
You see, sometimes language conceals everything. So let's use the language to reveal something here. So when we say dropping the body, when we say like consciousness no longer in the body, right? The body becomes no longer the vehicle. Let us have a proper understanding of this, because that may create a platform or may give us a different perspective on this whole thing. What do we consider life? From the vantage point of being alive, from the point of being alive, right? From the point of being in this body. What goes under the name existence. Very often is being associated with the life force which allows this experience of being alive. Like that electricity which empowers the house and all its gadgets and all its equipment, right? And above all else providing the light and energy to cook food and so forth, right? That life current, life force. And we speak about life as that. And then dropping the body here literally means the time when life force leaves the body. Literally. Is withdrawn. Withdrawn. And then what is of the body? The body is then being returned to the elements. Ashes to ashes, right? Dust to dust. And so David Bowie sang.
And so what?
There's a famous song by David Bowie.
Oh.
David, you know, that pop singer. Ashes to ashes. Dun, 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 dun. I love that song. Oh, let's dance. There's another one. Put you on your red shoes. So, life current just, that life force is being withdrawn from the body. But what happens? Let's just go into it a little bit and see and examine it. Because that might give us another perspective altogether.
Can I add something?
Sure.
That I could incorporate is because I had it in my mind before we start about embodying while we're in the body. So I would love to know if you would like to tie it all together a little.
But before we go about the business of embodying, right? Let's just finish with the business of disembodying. So, this life force, as we know, contains and sustains all functionings in this body. Absolutely all. All of them. And then we can go through which ones are the most principal, without which it's impossible even to speak about being alive, right? And the breath will be one, immediate one, right? It's something that the carrier, the vehicle of life sustains itself. It sustains life. And other things, like fluid intake and so forth. Food intake or some kind of nourishment intake, so that there is rebuilding material for the cells. If we have that understanding, that we see that there is something, some process in motion, some process, the elements, the elemental order itself comes together and is being sustained by life force. And all this is a very complex affair. How then in that sustenance there is this various processes at work all time. Old cells die, new cells are being born continuously. In other words, I often give that example on the theme of dying. We're constantly dying and constantly being reborn. Even on that level, if we talk about the gross physical body, we constantly are dying. Everything, the skin dies every day, right? Like the cells inside every organ, inside every tissue. This is straightforward, obvious stuff. We know that. And the new cells are being born, replenished, and that is unstoppable. It's unstoppable, literally. While everything is being sustained by life force. And yet there is still this aging. There's something we call that aging. Because in some ways and somehow that, let's say, replenishment, renewal, right? The new cells, at some point, as if that becomes more sluggish and cannot catch up with what is maybe dying faster than is being reborn. Let's just look at it for a moment. So all this suddenly like, oh, I'm no longer 20, like sort of a bit of a, no longer 30, no longer 40,
No longer 50.
No longer, well, I haven't reached that threshold yet, but very close. That hair width, but so there is this kind of continuous, and yet there is something I want to take our attention to, and yet it will be a mistake to say that it's only like that. It will be only one perspective, only one picture, or only one, looking at it from one perspective. Because there is something else being born now, the attention is shifts elsewhere. The emphasis is elsewhere. If before the emphasis was in building the body, right, at the earlier ages, earlier phases, the body was small, it came small, right, it didn't have much hair, right, everything was small and it starts to grow, it didn't have teeth, bones were not bones, like all this bendy stuff, soft and gummy, then it suddenly acquires a bit of a structure and it kind of grows and it becomes bigger and heavier and hairier and toothier and teethier, and we bite into the life, right, with greater force because we're given that opportunity. So consciousness here in the body is busy building something. And then the time comes, it's like other aspects begin to be built. We expand, not just physically, we expand internally, externally, internally, right? Let's just have this kind of like, toss it in the air. Let's see what comes out. And yet, there comes a time when we kind of like take a shape or form, plus or minus, like 25, 22, already reach that height, kind of building that width, in terms of the bone, at least, structure, right? Depending on the diet, and predispositions and our individual constitutions. Kind of not much room to grow physically in terms of putting on weight or losing weight. It's all the same, really. But the work then is being continued elsewhere. The emphasis now is to grow other parts, maybe parts on which we cannot put our finger on. In other words, it did not stop at that level. It carries on. So we can apply the same logic to that process of aging. That aging here is not just because, oh, cannot keep up with renewing the cells. The emphasis, perhaps, of the prana now, of that vital force, of that vitality, of that precious, universal energy, goes elsewhere. It expands and is busy at other areas, not necessarily at the level of the physicality of the body and its processes, because it knows the body will go at some point. It's busy to serve the soul from its other perspectives. So it's a dignified, if you will, more integral, or seeing the aging with integrity, with an eye of integrity. Becoming wiser, hopefully, right? Not silly, but wiser. Because some of us, still can behave like irresponsible teenagers. Age is not, it's not something that stops us from that. But we're trying to apply the common sense here. And that common sense, where the evolution is that driving force, now responsible for these invisible, very subtle processes of another kind of maturity. It is for that reason Indian spirituality viewed human life from the perspective of different stages, and there were distinctive stages. Each had a name and a purpose. There is a stage once all these duties in the world are more or less being performed, fulfilled, if you will, to whatever degree. There comes this stage known as a forest dweller. Not that you lock your house, run away from your kids and grandkids, from your friends and go into the forest. But the forest dweller here means something else. It's the time to return. Other aspects of this existence become, or other facets of this existence become way more important. And we are therefore advised to hear that calling. And again, you can see that, and it will be a mistake to see it only like from that age to that age, from that age to that age. You can see that loosely, but roughly there are these dynamics. Some people become forest dwellers at the age of 20 because they're ready. It's a different story. They're ready to awaken. The calling of the spirit is already there, at that tender age when physiology itself may be still growing. So going back to the business of disembodying, right, dropping the body. What is happening to the body? What was the body here throughout all this time? And what was its purpose? First of all, I just want us for a moment to go and see that what is actually happens is that nothing actually dies here. So to understand properly what life and what death means. Because when we understand that, or rather, when we try to locate where death is, we will have a very hard time. Especially if we're smart. If we have a penetrative insight and uncompromising insight into this whole business. Because something what we call death does not exist in a sense of what we apply to that term. It's a very freeing, very liberating inquiry, because it presents us with a discovery of our true identity, even if at that stage only as identity with the soul, before we can then identify or merge with the Absolute. Because our soul may still be in a cycle of transmigratory existence. But soul is immortal. So the term death here applies only to the very, very physical structure. But physical structure does not die either. And this is where I wanted to talk about. So in other words, I want us to dissect the very nature of death, to see what actually dies here, and how can that be called death. If we have established that this was indeed a continuous, uninterrupted process from day one, from the moment of conception, soon as there's something miraculous happened and the life took hold and starts to evolve, and that what we call fetus, until the first breath is taken in. And all the way until the last has been inhaled. When a life force which is the carrier of our soul, departs, as it were, literally leaves the pathways of pranic flow, and I will go back to it in a moment, so that we don't leave this without properly allocating and talking about this process. What happens to the body is not just a kind of random, like, okay, now it's irrelevant stuff. It's one type of prana is being left in the body to make sure it will decompose gracefully. Even if it, from human perspective, from common perspective, it may not be a nice sight. But there is one prana, literally, performs that function. It stays in the body to make sure elements are being reassembled and returned back to their respective domains, each and every one of them. In other words, just as this elemental order is being put together, in the same marvelous way, that elemental order is being now dissembled. Literally, the elements are being given freedom to unite with the subtle provenance, to the area of the subtler provenance where they came from in the first place. And that's what it means, dust to dust, ashes to ashes. And as I said earlier, the breath itself, that last breath, follows the pathway of one of the principal pranas. The whole retreat, by the way, in I looked at you, but I know you were not there, but just the last retreat in Canada was precisely on that subject, and we will return to it in the coming one, so that we are not left without this theme, dedicated to the 5 pranas, to 5 principal pranas. One of them is Udana, the upward movement of pranic flow. Udana prana in a so-called living, functioning organism is responsible for vocal expression and for thought and speech and all forms of creativity. It is the 5th prana through which awareness literally expresses itself creatively in this body. Because all other pranic flows perform the so-called physical functions. And if you study Ayurveda, you will know these pranas, know like prana, apana, vyana, udana, and samana. There are 5 of them. And udana is that one. It's literally the 5th type of prana which is responsible for creative expression. Thinking is creative expression. Speech is the creative expression of consciousness. it moves in the body, literally in that area. It leaves from the chest up through the throat, through the nasal passages. But at the time of the departure of the soul from the body, that prana carries the soul out of the body to merge it into a subtler realm. You see? So in other words, it's another spin on this whole thing. And this is why all this NDE, right? Near-death experiences are so, all this comparative analysis of all various NDEs are so similar. And gives that what gave people, those who have been piling up all these records, like even clinical records, to simply come to a conclusion that there is something common. Because there is something very common in all these experiences. They all describe that very process with a slight varying degree of, accuracy, or maybe imagination, and different character comes up with different storyline. But there is this, like going through a corridor, kind of like coming to a certain area of a greater light, sense of great speed, and being transported, essentially. Seeing a lot, maybe just prior to that, seeing a lot of imagery, the whole life goes by, right? But that's the prana moves very, that's pranic current. So this is in as much as the dropping the body, see? Something gathered together, these elements that they gather together, and in that sacred gathering there is this possibility for an expression what otherwise exists on a very subtle level, extremely subtle level, is being now given a chance to be expressed at this level. And some of you may know, some of you may not know, but every sense perception, right? Every sense perception, such as hearing, touching, seeing, tasting, and smelling, has its provenance in a subtler region, in a subtler domain. In other words, all this all this gamut of sensory perceptions is a reflection of a much subtler processes, and this is what is known in yoga or in any other traditions as refinement of perception. And you can experience this, as I did myself, and I know many others who did that, who went through that. You experience all these subtle phenomena. You hear these celestial sounds, you sense, the aromas that are not next to you, they are not on the physical plane. You experience the divine touch, and you experience all these phenomena, each one allocated to the respective organs of cognition, internally, within yourself. And this is what it is. It's like the greater universe, the subtler universe is being revealed, and then you understand how this whole creation relates, how this universe functions on and from that level. That this, what we call gross realities, has its purpose. It's these divine energies manifest themselves and find their expression through this physiology. And this is the answer to your addition to the embodiment, because I don't know what you meant by embodiment, but to me this is the mystery of the embodiment, because embodiment is that.
Maybe I was wondering, is that people speak about, awakening is that when you realize the embodiment and of, does that make sense?
No, don't worry about that. Like, don't go in with your head there.
Yeah.
You know? Don't go with your head. Don't try to tie it all in with what you know.
I don't know anything.
Yeah. No, but you know what I mean? Like, so like,